Those self-sufficient yeoman farmers who had hardly seen or needed money were now growing wheat and cotton, cash crops. The farmers were using the money they got for their cotton and wheat to buy food for their families, and luxuries too. America was developing a money economy, and that was causing all kinds of discussion. Should a farmer borrow money and go into debt to buy farm equipment? Was that immoral, or was it just smart? Money was changing the United States, and England and other nations too. The Industrial Revolution started it. It made capital, money, essential for business growth. New commercial interests, businesses and railroads and banks, were looking for money and demanding power and influence. The old guard, those who already had money and influence, was trying to control and slow the rate of growth. It was all confusing and terrifying to those who were attached to the new idea of self-government. John Calhoun wrote that liberty was never in greater danger. Andrew Jackson was the common person's president. He thought the money interests were asking for special privileges from the government and getting them. If we cannot at once make our government what it ought to be, we can at least take a stand against the advancement of the few at the expense of the many. Jackson took his stand when he killed the Bank of the United States. That helped set off a depression, but it was Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, who had to deal with it. Yet nothing was going to stop the drive for wealth and achievement, not in a free nation. Nor could anything stop people from getting angry about it. When the writer James Fenimore Cooper came home in 1833 after a long stay in Europe, he was horrified by an attitude that seemed to have taken hold in his country. The desire to grow suddenly rich has seized on all classes, one character complained in Cooper's novel Homeward Bound. Were Americans losing their souls in a search for riches? Some thought so. But that drive for individual riches had surprising consequences. It would make the whole nation rich. It provided better food, clothing, and shelter to more people than in any nation before. It spawned ideas and poetry and songs. You see, this new nation had an unusual goal. It had been directed by its founders to pursue happiness. That was such a simple, logical goal, but no nation seems to have thought of it before. Besides, what is happiness, and how do you pursue it? There were lots of answers to that question. Some people said happiness was having land. Some said it was being rich. Some said it was going to school. Some said it was having a fine family. Some said it could be found in religion. Some said it was being free. Some said, well, you get the idea. Different people have different ideas about what will make them happy. This was a nation trying to find ways to let each citizen pursue his own goals without hurting anyone else, which was a new thing for a nation to do and not easy at all. Some people were clearly off the track. How can anyone pursue happiness if he or she is a slave, or is keeping others enslaved? How can anyone be happy if he is being lied to, or is thrown off his land? This country was very young. We had a lot to learn. The antebellum time was a period of growth and experimentation. It was a time when gold seekers took up pickaxes and shovels, when preachers led big outdoor church gatherings, when abolitionists tried to right a terrible wrong, when some people were vile and others were virtuous. Whether it all seemed mostly good or mostly bad, or something in between, one thing was sure. It was not a time to be bored. Chapter 1. The Long Way West. When President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, a few people grumbled, but most Americans approved. Hardly anyone had liked the idea of France having land on the border of the United States, or of France controlling the port of New Orleans. Otherwise, nobody seemed to know what to do with the territory. It was a huge hunk of land that went from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Later, it became 13 states. But the Louisiana Purchase didn't include southern and western lands that ran from Texas to California and north to the edge of Wyoming, a region that would become all or part of 8 more states. That land was all called California, and Spain owned it, and it didn't include a northern region known as the Oregon Country. Britain claimed Oregon, though there was some dispute about it. Actually, it was mighty strange that France, Spain, England, and the United States were buying and selling the land as it was inhabited and presumably owned by Indian nations that had lived there for thousands of years. But most Europeans and Americans talked of the Indians as savages, and they usually acted as if those savages had no rights. Of course, the Indians believed they had rights. They weren't willing to give up their land. They would fight for it. But that came later, when railroad trains, called iron horses, thundered across the buffalo ranges, and an endless parade of men from the east killed the buffalo, and the Indians' way of life, too. Early in the 19th century, most people in the United States thought there was plenty of room for the Indians on the land to the west of the Mississippi, and at first the Indians were friendly toward the newcomers. Besides, few Americans seemed to have any desire to live in the Louisiana Territory. Mostly they were just curious about it, the way we wonder about distant planets. Besides, if you believe you own something, it makes sense to find out exactly what it looks like, and, aside from what Lewis and Clark and a few other explorers had reported, no one knew much about the western lands. So, in 1819, President Monroe's Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, decided to organize an exploring expedition to find out about that across-the-Mississippi region. He asked a U.S. Army Major, Stephen H. Long, to take charge. Long had been an assistant professor of mathematics at West Point after graduating near the top of his class at Dartmouth College. He set out on a 2-year journey. Edwin James, who was a scientist and a surgeon, went with him. So did artists Titian Peale and Samuel Seymour. They were sent to draw pictures of the landscape, the animals, and the flowers. Those were the days before photographers. James wrote a 2-volume account of the journey and made an atlas, too. None of the members of the expedition seemed particularly impressed with what they found. This was what Long said about the plains that went from the edge of the Mississippi woodlands to the Rocky Mountains. In regard to this extensive section of the country, I do not hesitate in giving the opinion that it is almost wholly unfit for cultivation, and, of course, uninhabitable by a people depending upon agriculture for their subsistence. He called it the haunt of bison and jackal, whose sole monarch was the prickly pear. On Edwin James's official map of the expedition, the Great Plains is labeled the Great American Desert. It was just as well, thought Major Long, that this land was unfit for human habitation, except by Indians, and most people didn't worry about them. It would, he said, serve as a barrier to prevent too great an extension of our population westward. This was fertile land, but Easterners didn't know it. They were used to chopping down trees to make farmland. People listened to Long, and for the next 20 years, most travelers who ventured west agreed. The Great Plains was an uninhabitable desert. So, aside from the Native Americans who lived there, only a few traders, trappers, mountain men, and scientists headed for the Great Plains, or beyond, to the tall, snow-capped mountains. Chapter 2. Mountain Men. The ad in the St. Louis newspaper in February 1822 called for men willing to try something new. Instead of buying furs from the Indians, as most American fur traders did, they were to live as the Indians lived and trap and hunt furs themselves. They were to go out into the unexplored West, to the Rocky Mountains and beyond, with a gun and a knife, some coffee and flour, to eat the game they shot and the berries they found, and to trap beaver for the fur market. William Ashley, who put the ad in the paper, would arrange a once-a-year riverside meeting, a month-long rendezvous, where they could all get together.